Hi, this is Brett McDonald, instructor for Atmospheric Science 2110, Introduction to Climatology. Today we'll be going over Chapter 11, Human and Ecosystem Vulnerabilities. So now that we have our basis of what climate change is and have projections of what it could be in the future, let's now examine the impacts of what might happen. So here's some big questions to ask ourselves as we head into this chapter is really what are the changes in climate expected to do to both people and natural systems across the earth. There are some groups of scientists who have gotten together and really explored this. You've probably heard about the National Climate Assessment. And then we'll get into looking at really specifically some of the areas. First one dealing with the ocean and sea level, not only within the ocean itself, but also impacts on the land. We'll look at how changes in different areas of the world affect other parts of the world. And then we'll look and see how we as humans are most vulnerable and in what areas. Whether it's our housing, whether it's our food, whether it's our health, all different areas. And then we'll look at finish off with some other areas in the biological environment as well. So to get into it, let's make sure that we have some terms down. Remember again that the vulnerability means the level at which something is affected by the change in the climate, how sensitive it might be, how susceptible it might be to the change. And especially in terms of the climate, with it changing so quickly, how those terms, that sensitivity can be attributed sometimes to the lack of the ability to adapt. Now, adapting means changing to it. So let's say, for instance, that one of the issues with climate change is the rising sea level. Well, an adaptation for those people who live within, the first 20 feet of sea level is physically moving. How easy is it for people or other biological systems to be able to do that? So that's terms of adaptation. Now we're going to be talking about a lot of different aspects of climate change, a lot of different hazards. So again, a hazard is a specific type of an event. We've already looked at potentially in increases in extremes, drought plus heavy precipitation events, potentially increases in tropical storms and such. So those are the individual hazards that we're going to look at. People across the globe are also exposed differently. So that's something to evaluate into it. And as I mentioned, there is the National Climate Assessment, which is done every couple of years, where hundreds of experts from across all different kinds of fields get together, identify the science, identify the expectations, and then they really get into identifying what those potential impacts can be, especially in trying to help us mitigate any negative effects on our society. So here's a nice map which shows some areas across the whole entire globe of some different things that could be impacted by climate change. And they've broken this down into the blue things are your physical systems, and we'll look into like diminishing glaciers or drought and diminishing rivers, things like that. There's also biological systems, what might happen to forests, especially with increasing wildfires or things like that. And then the reds are specifically identified in terms of human systems. Big thing dealing there with food. And then there's other aspects as well. So you can see the level of confidence on the things that have been identified across the globe. So let's get into the first thing. And one of the big things that we talk about with the changing climate is a rising sea level. Remember again that as the average global temperature warms, we will see a melting of the cryosphere, of the frozen water that is above sea level, and then that will then go into the ocean system and raise the sea level. In addition, the ocean is also intercepting and absorbing so much heat that it's warming, and then that in turn causes a volumetric rise. And so, where is that really going to impact people? Well, first thing you think about are those island nations, which are barely above sea level right now. What might happen to them if the sea level rises by 3 feet? The whole entire island could be underwater. Other things like that. So here are, obviously, with sea level rising, here's a map of some areas around the globe where there are very large populations within that the coastal region. You can see that Asia potentially can be very, very impacted by this. Lots of people. I find it interesting they have Moscow listed here, and even Mexico City, because they're not near the coast. But a lot of them are near the coast. So this is an interesting one that shows projections of sea level rise. Now, there is an expectation of sea level rise even without ice sheet melting, but if you have the ice sheet melting as well, it's going to exacerbate the problem. So that could even occur within some large inland lakes. There's actually it says here there's a predicted drop in the water level, say for Lake Michigan, as you go further. Well, also, not only are we talking about the levels of the water bodies, but what is that going to do? Even here in Wyoming, we're starting to see toxic algae blooms in areas where they really haven't happened before, which is very interesting. So that can obviously affect the marine environment, as well as what we rely on from the marine environment as well. We talked about glaciers, and let's look at that a little bit more. Big areas that we're talking about are in Antarctica. There's been already documented a lot of melting occurring, and they've estimated the volume of water that then would, if that did melt, how much that would contribute to oceanic rise. So here's a cool map of Antarctica, which shows the potential areas that are most susceptible to melting at this time. Obviously, the ones right next to the oceans itself, and what volume they would contribute to the rising sea level. It's really amazing how much water content is contained in the Antarctic ice environment. I'm just going to keep going. And we'll show a map here really soon. But there's been a lot of studies which have tried to document and show exactly what Antarctica is composed of. So here's a really cool core where they actually the depth of the ice is almost 2.25 miles. And they've actually found that underneath the ice down at this level, there is a lake underneath. There's actually liquid water down here. And that in and of itself contains a lot of volume as well. It's interesting. We may not see it necessarily on the surface, but it's possible that temperatures down low are such that water can actually flow through some of the ice itself, and so that can contribute as that gets squeezed out into the oceans. There's a nice little diagram which shows how some of that might occur even within the ocean environment. So they really do keep a big track on different aspects of these ice sheets and glaciers as they interact the water surfaces. I'll let you read more about Icebridge and GRACE and these other studies that have happened. Let's move on from Antarctica here. I'm going to keep going because I want to get to Greenland. This one's been more in the news lately because scientists have found that since the book was written and should be updated next year, that they're encountering even more melting than they've recognized before. Starting to see, in the summer times, incredible melting on the surface of Greenland, and how much water is actually running off. But even they've looked back at averages. So the map on the left shows the average annual average number of melt days, fewer obviously in the middle and more on the edges. And then they compared that with what happened in 2012, and you'll notice that it's obviously increasing. If we were to see similar maps, even of the last couple of years, we would see it happening even more now. So a lot of water is being released from the Greenland ice sheet, being melted off because of the warming temperatures. Here's some nice images of some things that they monitor. These lakes that form on top, and then how they get drained through the crevasses that get created and are increasingly becoming bigger. That's pretty amazing. If the Greenland ice sheet were to completely melt and go into the ocean, it would raise the mean sea level by an estimated 24 feet. That's just incredible. And as you've already learned, it's kind of becoming more of a positive feedback cycle, because as the melting increases, the albedo is changing of the ice that's on Greenland. And then that just encourages more and more melting, which changes the albedo, and etc. We just keep going into this cycle. Now, one of the cool things is that people are monitoring glaciers even here in the mountain areas, even here in Wyoming. This is a cool time section or an image of showing some glaciers. I would assume that this is a glacier national park. The changes in the glaciers through the years here in the Rockies, and what that's meaning, shrinking them. If I remember correctly, they're estimating that the glaciers in Glacier National Park will be completely melted. I'm thinking it was 2050. We'll see if it has that information here. But it's crazy. So not just here in North America, but also in the Alps. And there's some scientists who are trying to do some things to protect them, even covering them with white cloths to increase the albedo so that they won't melt so quickly. The reason why this is such a concern is that there's so many people around the world who rely on the freshwater melt from glaciers throughout the year, and that's a big impact. Even here in Wyoming, we're a headwater state, and so we rely on that as well. And so as the glaciers in the Wind Rivers and in other areas are shrinking, that means less water at the times when we need them. This will then impact somewhat some of the ocean depths. The volume of water that's actually contained in glaciers and mountains is not nearly as much as, say, Greenland or Antarctica, but there can be a change there. We'll just move on. So let's move from South Pole to mountains to the Arctic. We've talked about this a little bit, but one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now is the real increase in warming in the northern hemisphere, in the Arctic region. You've seen maps already that have shown that the warming that's going on in the Arctic is like 2 to 3 times what's going on across the entire globe. And so this is affecting a lot of different things. The biggest thing that we can monitor is sea ice, but then we're also seeing permafrost changes. As we mentioned, the hydrologic cycle, it's modifying animals and what they can do. The polar bears are a great example up there, but also the people that live up there too. This is interesting that many of the Inuits are starting to have issues that they didn't before because of changes in the environment up there. And then one of the things that we've talked about a lot or seen before too is, well, how much further north are diseases that are associated with insects, mosquitoes specifically, is that moving north as well. And so it's really impacting that. Cute little diagram here showing how the Arctic environment is so dependent on a variety of different things, with the mammal life, birds, the aquatic life, everything that goes on is being impacted by it, and we're really seeing it happen. We've seen how oceanic temperatures warming are changing the coral reefs and affecting those marine environments around the world as well. So let's move on here. So let's go to the land, and the big thing to understand too with our impacts on the earth is the societal impact is becoming more and more. One reason is because there's so many more people on the earth. This is an amazing diagram that's been a graph that's been put together showing basically the estimation of the world population, and how in the last couple, 1 to 200 years, the population on the earth has just skyrocketed. It's pretty amazing. Now at the present time, we're able to do what we can, but is that going to be possible in the future to maintain even the number of people that we have right now, and what will that mean? Not exactly sure what this diagram is showing, but I believe it's indicating the different continents, different areas on the earth, and how many people are vulnerable to these changes that go on. Let's look here. So there's some different ideas on what a warming climate will do with agriculture. Will it increase? Because we know biologically that plants actually take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So will an increasing carbon dioxide, it will increase water vapor in the atmosphere, lead to better food production? Or will that be countered by issues with drought or excessive water or other things like that? Those are really good questions. But we've been able to see that in areas, some areas, it might make changes where we aren't able to overcome. We've looked a little bit already. I think we had some questions in a recent current climate study about where we get our water from. The amount and the quality of fresh water is changing due to climate change. One of those is in, say, aquifers, where people get water for irrigation. I know even here in Fremont County, people have noticed a declining water level, so that their wells have to be dug deeper in order to get to fresh water. It's been a change around here in the middle of Wyoming. So then you get to the political and the legal issues of the water rights. That's an area that I know very little of, but it will definitely become an impact. We're seeing that even this year in the extremely low flows in the Colorado River. And the question becomes, well, who has the right to the water in the Colorado River? Is it the people who live hundreds of miles away from it, where it's previously been pumped to, say like in Los Angeles and other areas? Or is it people who live right next to it? There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. Regardless, it's pretty sure that climate change is going to cause issues in the future with crops and the global food supply, as potentially population increases, but the food supply decreases. It will put us in a more vulnerable situation. So what are some areas where we can potentially work on a little bit better? There are more effective ways of growing crops, of using the water, both fresh water and salt water, to have environments that we can create what we need. there's big changes in, obviously, fishing, as we rely on the oceans. So what can be done? Well, you've learned already about the Green Revolution and how we're actually becoming more effective at and efficient at growing crops. And so I think that's just going to need to continue, especially as we deal with changing climate across our areas. These are some interesting graphs on expected changes in different kinds of crops. It's interesting that not everything is the same. And notice here that alfalfa actually kind of is expected to relatively change, whereas there's other types of crops which will be severely impacted based upon, different expected changes in the atmosphere. I hadn't thought about that before. And then one of the things that you've learned about then too is what's one of the major reasons why we then have social unrest and changes even within the society. This last year and a half has been pretty interesting, teaching us that with even something such as a virus that goes around, people have very differing opinions. Well, changing food availability and being susceptible to issues there has proven in the past to cause incredible social unrest and violence. Can we expect that to happen in the future? It's very possible. And so we'll see, if we as humans can come together to adapt, or whether we won't. And that might just change and make bigger issues with things. Just going to keep going here. So there's an interesting new term for you, bioclimatology, connections between changing climate and the biosphere. I think there's some unknowns with that. We're seeing a lot more heat wave. The heat waves that we had this year in 2021 were pretty incredible. And so what are we going to do to change the way we live in order to deal with that? That's a really good question, because a lot of it depends on energy as well and what we can do there. I mentioned briefly before diseases and other issues, and we have seen already in the past that increasing temperatures help to spread those problems into areas where they really haven't been before. How far north is West Nile virus going to get with mosquitoes and other things like that? So that's really another interesting area where you tie in with the medical community in terms of a changing climate and what that could mean for all of us. So here's some areas, mentioning one of those is Lyme disease. I'd always thought of that as something as an issue back east because of the disease being with certain types of ticks. Here's showing areas of the country which could potentially be more susceptible to changes with climate change, and makes you almost not want to go visit some of these parts of the country in the future. So it's going to be interesting in the eastern part of our country what kinds of things we see happen, with the deer tick and Lyme disease. So I'd mentioned before, another aspect of the biosphere are trees and how they deal with it. We've already seen here in Wyoming what happens with our forests, say when a drought situation comes in and you get pine beetle affecting massive amounts of forest. Well, is that something that's going to happen more in the future? We don't know. Potentially it could be, but it also could lead to more forest fires. With the trees, it's a big part that they're obviously a big area where trees can potentially help curb our carbon dioxide amounts in the atmosphere, but in areas of the globe where, massive deforestation. So it's actually causing problems. I mentioned that, Amazon is one of those, but there's other areas in the world where deforestation is reducing the amount of trees that can help with the increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So obviously that's been a push for a couple of decades, but it's still causing problems because people in those areas are feeling the more need for land to get food on rather than keeping the trees around to keep the other problems from happening. You can see how many fires are going on in Amazon area because of people burning and getting rid of that. Here in the U.S., we're seeing increased number of forest fires due to drought and warming temperatures. And how are our living species going to deal with that? Some things can change fairly well. The mammals and other things can move around, but there's other types that can't. Obviously, trees don't move, but there's also some kind of animals that really have an issue with moving and adapting as well. What's going to end up happening probably is things that we see occurring south are going to move north, and there's going to be potentially limited area for them to go. So finish up this chapter. Thanks for listening. It's really interesting to think about how everything is so interconnected, and when there's a change, say with the climate, what does that mean for everything else? How vulnerable are certain aspects of our Earth atmosphere system and our social system? And what can we do to mitigate those impacts or adapt to help keep things at least civil so that we can keep living on this earth? Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.